welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosatris, and this week we're talking about the death of the author. This is a term that kind of gets thrown around a lot, especially when dealing with problematic media, and I don't think everyone's using it the way that it's supposed to be used. So I wanted to do a quick rundown. This is going to be kind of a shorter video because this has been a crazy week, you guys. It has just been chaos. And I have things I have to get done. So we're going to do this quick and simple, and I'll try not to digress too much, which is, I can't really promise that because I'm probably going to digress a whole bunch. Anyways, death of the author. So what death of the author isn't is, well, I can just separate the art from the artist and I don't have to worry about what the author's views are and just enjoy their work. Because it doesn't affect me. And that's not quite it. It's almost it, but there's nuance there, because, nuance. And the internet, as we all know, is a great place for nuance. There's a lot of that. So, anyways, we're going to start with Roland Barthes. And there's going to be a lot of really awful French in this video. I'm sorry, I don't speak French, but I'm going to do my best, and we'll see. So, this is Barthes is a 20th century French philosopher. And he's a critical theorist, and his whole thing is looking at signs and symbols, the field of semiotics, which to this day I can't really give a good, concise definition of. Maybe one of these days I will stretch my brain to extreme lengths and try to explain what semiotics is and what semiology is and what structuralism is and post-structuralism and all those fun things. But the big thing is Roland Barthes, and this book, Mythologies, is kind of a collection of his essays where he looks at that kind of stuff. He looks at sort of signs and symbols in popular culture and how meaning can sometimes drift away from reality in favor of kind of bourgeois opinions of what it could be. He uses a bunch of examples, and they're all very cool. Like, think of it like, there's the realities of like what wine is, but like to the French, wine is also like a symbol of like culture and extravagant, not extravagance, but like, relaxation and indulgence, and it's there's a whole lot of cultural stuff applied to it. It's not just wine. If you call it just wine, like the French will chop off your head because they're good at that. So anyways, so we've got Barthes here, and so in 1968 he wrote an essay called La Mort de l'auteur, and I hope I pronounced that right, but it's the death of the author. Now that's not to be confused with La Mort d'auteur, which is something totally different and unrelated. But what he was talking about is, he talked about how theorists and scholars sometimes need to, like, unhook their criticism of a text from, like, knowledge of the author. Like, there's no, like, so when you hear people talking about, like, this is what the author meant, it's like author intent. He kind of says that's not really necessary because interpretation is subjective, if that makes sense. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. So an example of this is, we're going to look at Hamlet, because that's a pretty well-known one. You could read it as an expression of Shakespeare's own grief at losing his son Hamnet, and kind of try to figure out, like, what did Shakespeare mean? I know you've probably all had those English teachers, especially in high school, they love this, where they'll be like, what do you think Shakespeare meant when he had Ophelia drown herself? Or, like, what's the secret message behind all this? And they always act like there's, like, one specific message or one specific meaning behind a text. I know not all English teachers do this, but I encountered so many of these. And so just, like, there's sometimes when you think, it's like, what did the author mean? Like, what's the correct version of things? Like, what's the best way to analyze a text? And Barthes is over here saying, you don't need to do that. Art is subjective. You can find your own interpretations of a text. There's no need to obsess over sort of what the author meant or what the author intended specifically. Barthes often said that you should address a text as something that like you engage with and you find things with. Regarding Hamlet, one person could maybe read it as like a feminist text looking at the treatment of women in this society. You've got Ophelia and Gertrude, both of whom die at the end, or near the end, and you can have it look at sort of their lack of agency and what they wanted, but they weren't allowed to have because they basically had to go along with whatever kind of the male characters do. Ophelia is just tossed around by this story, and Gertrude kind of accidentally dies at the end. And it just feels like these two are just sort of tragic casualties of sort of male influence. So you could read it that way. You could read it as a look at loss and grief. There's all different kinds of ways you can interpret a text, and there is no one specific correct version. So ultimately, death of the author pertains to the reader's relationship with a text. It doesn't see a novel or a play or a poem as sort of a locked chest with like one single key, and that one key opens it and there's a piece of paper inside that says this is the meaning and this is how you interpret it, kind of thing. It sees it more as like an open chest that's full of all kinds of knickknacks and doodads and stuff, and the reader can sift through it, find the stuff that they like, and engage with that aspect of the story, because like texts are intersectional, and that's why I think contemporary criticism is so much more interesting. In the early 20th century, you had like the new critics who were like, they were trying to make it like a scientific thing where like, you know, you wouldn't think about reader response, you wouldn't think about author, you'd just sort of scientifically analyze a text as like a self-contained thing. And it was kind of like they were looking at like gemstones and like cataloging like the hardness and the planes and the light refraction. It's like they were being very like almost too clinical about it. And Barthes is very much kind of reacting to them. He sort of laughs at them in his essay. And so you want to engage with it in an intersectional way and understand that everyone has different experiences, and there's also different lenses that you can use. When you're reading like literary articles, scholarship and whatnot, you'll often hear them say, you know, something like, this text can be interpreted in a way that, or one way to look at it is, or in my opinion, this is a great example of, or something. It's very clear they're saying like, this is my opinion, and this is kind of what I'm going for. Now, some authors will like take, or some writers will take their opinion of a text and they'll frame it as if it's some kind of like objective truth. The really pretentious ones do this, and it's so annoying. They'll be like, this is obviously the way that you read this. And it's like, is it? Or is that just your interpretation? Because interpretations are fine. You can interpret a text however you want. And there is no like one correct version. Now, I will say lit scholars can sometimes get really attached to their own interpretations, and I'm guilty of this too. This is terrible. In grad school, I wrote an essay about The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, and I interpreted it as if it was like a zombie novel, because it is. Like, he even has visions of like the dead rising and attacking him. But that's my interpretation, and I have a hard time when I see other kind of interpretations of it being like, I guess you can believe it that way, but like my way is the correct way. So like, be aware of that, because scholars are dumb and they get attached to their own version of the way that they think things should be. And sometimes it doesn't enter their brains that other people interpret a text differently. And that's a bad habit, so you want to be open to other interpretations even if you don't like it. And this goes for everything from like literature to like the latest Star Wars show. So, you know, be aware. This is relevant. This isn't just a nerd talking about books. This is like a real thing. Going on, now there are times when there's a symbol in a book that feels very obvious. I'm thinking of, for example, in like Wuthering Heights. You've got the Moors, and they're very wild and untamed, and Emily Bronte focuses on that a lot. And a lot of like, it's almost a cliche. You can say like, even like an episode of Friends did this, where they'll be like, the Moors represent sort of Heathcliff's tempestuous mental state and his own wildness, and like, that makes sense. But even if there's a really obvious symbol, or even if like the author was interviewed at one point and they said, oh yeah, this totally means this specifically, that doesn't mean you need to be completely beholden to that. You can interpret things in different ways. Now, I know some scholars would probably get upset at that kind of loosey-goosey approach of like being too free-floating, or like whatever. But I don't know. I really like the deconstruction folks in like the mid 20th century, late 20th century, where they were like, turn it on its head, you'll find new things in it. I love that stuff. And so, I don't know. I think that it's just better if you engage with a text, just find what appeals to you, find what leaps out to you, and then put a lens over it and kind of engage with it in your own way. And I don't know, you'll find cool stuff in there. I think that's sort of my favorite way to engage with literary texts. So going back to Shakespeare, I'm going to use the example of The Merchant of Venice, his play The Merchant of Venice, specifically, I can't talk today, the character of Shylock. So in Shakespeare's time, Shylock was very obviously a villain. He was portrayed as kind of a hateful, evil, sneering, anti-Semitic stereotype. And the play is a comedy, so it was considered a really happy ending, at the end when he gets forcibly converted to Christianity and kind of led away in chains, and everyone was like, yay! It's sort of like the end of The Little Mermaid, where Ursula gets like impaled on the prow of a ship, and then she gets struck by lightning and then explodes. Just super wholesome family fun, right? And so the character in Shakespeare's time was very much a one-dimensional kind of villain. And in the 19th century, early 19th century, beginning with an actor named Edmund Kean, the character really kind of changed and was portrayed more sympathetically. Now, the text is nuanced enough that you can do that. A lot of Shylock's lines, which in Shakespeare's day would have been seen as like, pithy and, sarcastic and not meant to be taken seriously. If you deliver those lines earnestly, the character really becomes really complex and interesting. You see him as someone who's living in an unjust society, who has kind of sequestered his people away in like ghettos in Florence, Venice, Merchant of Venice. It's in Venice, not Florence, and kind of being seen as a threat to like correct Christian society, and being treated as like a subhuman class, but because they're good with money, they're kept around and used as kind of bankers and whatever. And so the character becomes sort of someone who's in a bad situation, is treated badly by society, and is trying to kind of gain some measure of control on his life. So Shylock is an antagonist, yes, but he's not really a villain in this kind of more nuanced portrayal. And that's the portrayal that kind of stuck. You do see him show up every now and then throughout the years as more of a kind of sneering one-dimensional villain. But the complex version of Shylock that came from this new interpretation of the character has really been what's kept the play relevant and meaningful, especially since we still see lots of anti-Semitism today. This is still a problem. And so, Shakespeare didn't intend for the character to be seen in a sympathetic light. And if he did, he maybe thought like, oh, well, some people might see him as sympathetic kind of thing. But it wasn't. He was very much portrayed as like an evil, sneering clown who gets defeated at the end. And I really like how we've managed to kind of change Shakespeare's version of things without changing the text. It's just in how he's presented. You know, there's no gruesome makeup and like the exaggerated hooked nose that you see, like the really stereotypical awful stuff, and has kind of given the character a lot of depth. One of my favorite portrayals is Al Pacino in the 2004 movie. He gives the character, like, he makes the character very much an antagonist. He's an angry character who is seeking revenge for how he's been treated, but he's layered. Like, he's not just a stereotypical villain. He's complex, he's interesting, he's likable, and you kind of understand where he's coming from. And it's really nuanced, and I really appreciate that. So that is sort of death of the author. And if we can do it to Shakespeare, then we can do it to any author. Basically, what it just means is that reader interpretations are subjective. There is no one perfect, correct interpretation of a text. And I mean, there's things like, you know, plot, and, you know, obviously you're not going to debate whether or not, like, Ahab dies at the end of Moby Dick, you know, kind of thing. But you can interpret it in different ways, and there's different lenses you can use. There's lots of different approaches, and there's cool stuff you find when you do that. And so there's different interpretations of characters, and there's nuance to be found there. One example is Frankenstein, the character of Victor Frankenstein, and I've seen so many wonderful interpretations of him as like a queer character, especially because of his little buddy, whose name I can't remember. That's terrible. I'm a bad person. Ugh. Anyways, you'll know who it is. Everyone who knows what I'm talking about is, like, you know, Frankenstein's best friend in the whole world, and they were roommates, kind of thing. Anyways, you know, interpret things kind of the way you like, and don't worry about what the author meant or what the correct interpretation of it is, because there's different things you can do. So that is Death of the Author. I hope that made sense. This was kind of a rambly, chaotic video today. But I will see you next week. Enjoy your reading, and I will hopefully be a little less chaotic next week, or more chaotic if you like the chaos. So I don't know, let me know. Anyways, see you then. Bye.